If you're watching this video right now, I would hazard a guess that you have a pretty lengthy history of playing games. Whether you grew up playing split screen with your siblings, or ventured alone into worlds bigger than you could possibly imagine, for many of us, gaming has been a massive part of our lives. But there are those who never had these experiences growing up. Maybe they weren't allowed to play video games when they were younger, or maybe the games weren't even around to play. But if someone who had no experience playing games wanted to start, how would you introduce them to the medium? I started thinking about this recently when I was around some older family members who never grew up with video games. Many of their children are now avid players, and I see them try and play with them sometimes, but there's a barrier to entry for most of them. See, unlike most other forms of entertainment, video games require an active participant. They cannot be experienced passively. In fact, it's often this need for interactivity that forms the very definition of a game. Films, for example, can be watched from an incredibly early age. They require little cognitive ability to initially consume. Of course, films can be understood more and more as time goes on, and there are movies that vary in depth and complexity. But what I mean is someone can watch a movie and experience the entire thing from beginning to end with little obstacles in their way. Games, on the other hand, immediately require a level of conscious decision making and input for them to be enjoyed. A game can almost never progress without a player participating in it, whether through a controller, keyboard and mouse, speech or gesture. You may not even realise this when playing, but you're making hundreds of decisions, calculations and actions at any given moment. You're receiving huge collections of data that your brain must process and then respond to via inputs, usually through a controller or keyboard. This may be second nature to anyone who's played games from an early age, but to someone being introduced to games for the first time, using a controller and carrying out all of these actions is an incredibly overwhelming experience. Let's look at something simple like the original Super Mario Bros. When the first level of Super Mario begins, the player is immediately greeted with a simple 2D environment. They see a blue sky, some green hills and bushes, a platform along the bottom, and then a character standing ready facing to the right of the screen. There are no instructions for the player, and yes, there was a manual that came with the original game, but if you didn't read that, there are no obvious clues as to what to do next. Without any player input, the game will stay exactly like this. The game can go no further than its beginning. There is no way it can progress or end, and the only thing that can change this is when the timer runs out in the top right corner, or through player input. The game needs the player's interactions and decisions in order to move on and unveil what else it has to show. But to begin playing, a player has already had to take in a mountain of information about what's going on in the game and use that to decide what to do next. Again, it sounds simple, but if anyone has handed over the controller to someone who hasn't ever played before, I'm sure you've seen the straining confusion in their face. Of course, none of this is helped by having to convey a player's responses in an unfamiliar way. To people who have been playing video games for the majority of their lives, controls are a very intuitive interaction. Games tend to build on those that came before. Using Super Mario as the example still, in this game you do some of the simplest actions in all of gaming, those being to move and to jump. In this case you move on a 2D plane from left to right, with the jump action adding verticality to get over obstacles and defeat enemies. Being able to move the character on screen through player input is a fundamental pillar that crops up time and time again in almost every game that exists. And having learnt it in a 2D game first, you can then hopefully translate most of the principles to more complex environments. But for a beginner, something as simple as a platformer can be challenge enough. So how do you introduce these mechanics and rules in an approachable and easy to digest way? When I was younger, I remember receiving a Nintendo DS Lite for my 8th birthday, and the first games that I got for it were New Super Mario Bros. And Mario Kart DS. This was my first introduction to the Mario franchise, and although I didn't realise it at the time, these were possibly the most influential and informative games I would ever play. Not necessarily because they held a special place in my heart or mind, but I think these were in many ways the gateway to understanding how to intuitively play games. You see, the thing with Mario games is they're really meant for anyone. They're good, wholesome, family-friendly fun. There's a nice and gentle learning curve, and though they can reach levels of difficulty, overall they can be played and mastered by anyone. I vividly remember around this time seeing people who never took any interest in games buying DSs and copies of Mario Kart to play with their friends and family members. Mario Kart was a very easy to understand concept for people new to games. Although taking place in a 3D environment, the controls were 2D in principle, with left and right on the D-pad for steering, the A button to accelerate, and the B button to brake and reverse. Suddenly, fully grown adults who had never touched games before could pick up Mario Kart and actually be able to play. In contrast, I remember often asking my parents to help me in a truly 3D game like Spyro or Rayman, and them having almost no understanding of how someone could be coordinated enough to play. The DS along with the Wii seemed to be the perfect place for someone new to games to begin their journey. But this got me thinking about if I had to try and introduce someone to the world of gaming today. Obviously I have an endless list of games that I'd want them to play, but which ones are accessible enough to play with no prior experience? When I think of a fairly straightforward game, I might jump to something like the newest LEGO Star Wars that came out recently, which to me is a really easy to grasp game with not much complexity in how you play. But to someone who's never played a game like that before, they would have to understand how to move a character in a 3D space, get used to third-person shooting mechanics, be ready for environment-based puzzles, and perform quick and precise actions. This is a far cry from the simple move right and jump that was exhibited in a Mario game, not to mention the embedded history of video game design that we take for granted in so many games. I know Rasputin has touched on this in his popular video series Gaming for a Non-Gamer, where various tropes, iconography and level design have been repeated so often in games that it has become a universal language to those of us who play them. Unfortunately for anyone new, this history and knowledge is hard to pass on without having come up playing previous games. This can be things like red barrels that symbolise explosives, or a more textured door that symbolises it can be opened. To someone playing a game for the first time, these are hard things to convey, but yet experienced gamers just know. We know that certain areas are not meant to be accessed by the player. We know that large deposits of health before a new area mean there's likely trouble ahead, and we know that something flashing or glowing is calling for our attention. But these things mean nothing to someone who doesn't play games. How do you teach all of this to someone that hasn't had the experiences we've had? I think there are games like a Mario Kart that you can give to anyone and they'll quickly pick up how to play, but how do you graduate someone from a rather simplistic game to something more complex? Anyone can move a character left and right, but what do you do when the game begins to call for fast and sharp movements? You introduce more dangers and features without overcomplicating and overwhelming the player. Most of us started playing games as children, and when we fail back then, we are in the mindset to consistently try again. It may get frustrating at times, and perhaps there are occasions where we simply aren't ready for the newest challenge, but there's a mindset of maybe I'll be able to do that thing one day when I'm more experienced. With grown-ups, this is a lot more difficult. Adults can be notoriously bad at trying and learning new things, and when they do finally decide to give something a try, if it's difficult, they'll often give up before overcoming it. But if they are able to grasp the basics of something like a platformer or a racing game, then there's no reason why they can't push themselves and go further. It can be hard to illustrate the reward in pushing them past this point of discomfort, but if they can, then an entire medium is opened up for them to explore. Most of what I've been talking about has been in relation to handing a controller to someone unfamiliar with gaming. This is a pretty unusual device for most people to understand. It's easy to hold and there are perhaps some easy to identify buttons on it, but this doesn't really resemble anything that they will be used to using. I think this is why mobile gaming exploded with the rise of smartphones. Suddenly everyone had an easy to use gaming machine in their pocket that they were already familiar with from their everyday use. There's no controls or inputs to learn here. Most of the games require touch inputs such as tapping and dragging, and compared to console or PC gaming, the experiences are relatively simplistic in the first place. I think mobile gaming is a great way to introduce people to playing games. I think this is obvious with the huge numbers being pulled in by apps like Candy Crush or Clash of Clans. But there's a gulf in differences that just can't seem to be crossed from this to this. I actually thought virtual reality might be the solution to this problem. As learnt from the Wii, there's nothing easier to use than your hands and body. There was nothing to really learn on the Wii controller to play games like tennis or baseball. It relied on real-life actions to translate player input into the game, and I think this is an area VR could really build upon. Plenty of games have already experimented with this over the last 10 years, with naturalistic intuitive movements being incorporated into the majority of full-body VR games. I often thought this would be a good way to get people familiar with gaming in a more immersive environment that they could then translate to a more traditional way of playing. But unfortunately the promised future of everyone running around in PlayStation VRs and Valve Indexes seems to have been a little delayed. Virtual reality is still very much held ransom by its high entry point of sufficient system requirements and cost. Whilst we have seen plenty of attempts at creating an affordable solution for the masses, none of them have really taken off in the way they had hoped to, and for now, trying to convince someone that doesn't really play games to spend hundreds on a VR setup is not really realistic. So where does that leave us? If we're talking about the more traditional way of playing games, I think something like a Nintendo Switch or one of the cheaper versions of the PlayStation or Xbox could be a perfect entry point for new players. I personally would lean more to the Switch, primarily due to its more accessible and new player-friendly approach to gaming, not to mention its lineup of easy to understand, brilliantly designed first-party games. Even just playing through some of these will be an education for new players. Going from simplistic yet deep platforming in Mario, easy to comprehend shooting mechanics in something like Splatoon, and then graduating to a more complex yet fairly approachable open world RPG in Breath of the Wild. I also think the portability of the Switch is perfect for beginners, as the screen is right next to the controls, so it's a lot easier to glance at what your hands are doing without taking too much attention away from the gameplay. You'd be surprised how helpful this is to new players. The PS4 and Xbox One could also be great entry points, but I feel their first-party lineups would be a little complex for most new players. Not to mention both of these consoles seem to have a little less of an approachable aura than the Switch. I think it's a difficult task to try and introduce someone to gaming without growing up with it. For someone like me, it's been difficult to imagine the perspective of a person in this situation. Games have been a part of my entire life. I know their tricks and tropes. The controls are second nature to me, and there are some games that I've spent so much time in that they feel like a second home. However, this problem is something I've frequently been curious about over the years. How do you show someone the wonders of gaming when there is such a high boundary to experience most of it? I feel like I can enjoy so many games because of what I've played before, but it can be a lot to expect someone to get the same enjoyment out of a game without having the same journey I did to get there. I'm able to play something fast and high tempo like a first-person shooter because I've played my way through the groundworks of more simple games. I've learned all the basic concepts until I no longer have to think about what I'm doing and can just fully enjoy the game and what it has to offer. For a new player, this is practically impossible, as they will be too focused on how to play the game rather than the game itself. I've even thought about the potential for a standalone experience that acts as a kind of tutorial for all games, in which you would be able to teach the intricate concepts of games without the years of experience. I think it would still be an incredibly difficult undertaking for someone new, but it could be a good way of passing on the knowledge and core ideas in a short space of time without having to play the plethora of titles that would otherwise teach them. All I really want is for everyone to have the opportunity and ability to play any game they desire. I think it's such a shame that someone could be limited with what they play purely because they haven't played a game that came before it. Perhaps this will change in the future with more intuitive and approachable ways to play, but I think this could be some time away yet, and I would love to find methods in the meantime. I would be really interested to hear your suggestions on introducing new players to gaming. What game would you start someone off with today? Would you get them used to a controller or try and introduce them with something like virtual reality? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a like, and make sure to subscribe to see more videos from the channel in the future.